Okay, this is Biological Basis of Behavior Part 3 for Psychology 101 with Dr. Moses. Okay, so we're going to talk about neurons, right? So what is a neuron? Your very extraordinarily complex brain is comprised of trillions of neurons. That's what makes up the brain, are trillions of neurons and glial cells. Glial is spelled G-L-I-A-L. And what the purpose of the glial cells is to develop the neurons, right? They help guide the growth. It's sort of like a blueprint to developing the neuron. And they help provide nutrition for and get rid of any waste from the neuron. And they form the glial cells, like think of like glue almost, G-L-I-A-L. The glial cells form an insulating sheath around the neurons that speeds conduction, okay? So it helps speed conduction. So we'll talk a little bit more about what a neuron does, how they communicate, and that will make a little bit more sense to you in just a moment. But the neuron is the basic unit of structure and function of your nervous system. There's three roles that they play. There's three major functions. They receive information, they process the information, and they transmit that information to the rest of your body. Here in the pictures, if this were an in-person class, we would actually build a neuron out of pipe cleaners to help you remember how the neuron works and what each part is for. So for now, though, since this isn't in person, I provided some pictures of these pipe cleaner neurons, right? One way to think about a neuron is sort of like a headset receiver. Down there on the bottom, I gave you a depiction of that, like sort of what you use in gaming, right? So there's kind of this round part towards the top, you would say, and that's the cell body, right? Some people call it a cyton or a soma, but you could just call it a cell body, right? So the cell body, think of like a cell phone, right? You're holding a cell phone up to your ear, right? So if you're holding a cell phone up to your ear, near that cell body, near that cell phone up to your ear, picture these little spindles coming out of that, and those are called dendrites, okay? So when you're thinking about your ear and you're making a call, are you receiving information or are you sending information through your ear, through near that cell body and those dendrites? So the answer is you're receiving information, right? So picture kind of like, you know, hold like a phone up to your ear and think about that. So that right there, the dendrites that come out of the top are receiving information from another neuron, right? So they're receiving messages from a neuron. One neuron's talking to the other neuron, which is talking to the other neuron, which is talking to the other neuron, and they're sending information between each other. And then they're going to send that information throughout the body to tell the body what to do. So one way I remember that the cell body is next to the dendrites is just CD, like a CD player, like a CD, a compact disc CD, right? A CD, certificate of deposit, however you want to remember it, a CD, right? So C and D always go together, right? So the cell body has the dendrites receive the information. Then that information shoots down that long piece in the middle called the axon. So it's going to send an impulse down the axon, and it's going to send it out of the neuron into the next neuron, right? So it's sending it out through the terminal buttons, right? Through the synaptic terminal, through that end piece, right? So that end piece, the terminal, think of like a bus terminal for Greyhound or a terminal of an airport, right? The planes are leaving. You go to your terminal so you could depart, right? So that information was received in the dendrites, shoots down the axon, and then terminates. It kind of ends its life there in the neuron and passes on to the next neuron through that synaptic terminal or terminal buttons, right? If we think about it again as a cell phone, and if we were to hold that pipe cleaner neuron up to our ear and then have it kind of swing around down to our mouth, similar to the headphone set you see on the bottom, you would understand that, you know, through the mouthpiece of this headset, that's where we're sending information out, right? We're sending it to the next person through our voice. It's going into that little mouthpiece. So that's like your synaptic terminal, right? It's like the mouthpiece of the neuron. It's sending it to the next neuron. Myelin sheath it's formed by glial cells, right? It's almost like a glue. It's almost like a glue-like substance, right? Almost think of it like if you were to take a marshmallow, kind of that fatty substance of a marshmallow, and you were to kind of put it along the axon on your neuron. That's essentially kind of like the texture of myelin sheath. And myelin sheath is, it's sort of like an insulation. It keeps it warm, and that warmth that it gives it, that insulation that it gives it, helps the information shoot down the axon and kind of fire out like a gun through the synaptic terminal to the next neuron, okay? Neurogenesis, what that means is we grow neurons constantly throughout life. We grow new neurons. So it's not like we're born with neurons and then, you know, like we can't grow new neurons. It's not like they're you know, there is some use it or lose it pieces to neurons. Like if you're not making connections as a little infant child using certain neurons, then you kind of lose those neurons, right? They're never going to really necessarily grow back the way that they maybe had been intended to grow in the first place. So there is a use it or lose it piece, but we are very neuroplasticity. Our brain is very neuroplastic. It can grow new neurons, right? So it's not completely a lost cause in all situations, although for some there is a little bit of a lost cause, right? It's harder to grow those neurons later. Neurotransmitters, those are the chemicals that are stored in the structure of the terminal buttons. So there at the end in the synaptic terminal, you'll see there's kind of these button-like fixtures, and those are the chemicals. Those chemicals are called the neurotransmitters. And there's different neurotransmitters that perform different functions, right? So in your content area, I provided a chart that has, I think, 6 different neurotransmitters. In fact, yes, there's 6 of them that I listed here on this slide. Those 6, you should be familiar with what their function is and what their associations are, okay? So I'm just gonna give you like one example right now to kind of illustrate what a neurotransmitter does. So if I'm a neuron and I am in my terminal buttons, I have dopamine, right? That dopamine is going to communicate with, it's going to be transmitted to the next neuron, right? I'm going to shoot the dopamine from one neuron to the next neuron, and then that dopamine is going to shoot from one neuron to the next neuron. And when I have dopamine, the function of it is to help movement. It's for learning, it's for attention, it's for emotion, right? If I have too much dopamine, if too much dopamine is firing, is being transmitted from neuron to neuron, if I have too much dopamine, that's associated with the mental illness called schizophrenia, right? So it's not really a positive to have too much dopamine. We want just the right amount, okay? If we have too little dopamine, it can really affect movement and things of that nature and lead to Parkinson's disease. So when we have too little dopamine, we are going to, we may have that disease, okay? Serotonin, very similarly, serotonin, if that neurotransmitter is not firing to the next neuron the way it's supposed to, that's associated with having depression. This figure here on the right shows you how SSRIs work. You don't really have to know this, but I just thought it would be something that might help you understand this a little bit better. And you may have seen commercials for different SSRIs. Some of you may even take an SSRI. It's a type of medication used to help with depression, right? So SSRIs are serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So what you see there is you see at the top, right, you're seeing one terminal button from one neuron. And what you're seeing on the bottom is another neuron, another nerve ending that is going to receive the serotonin, right? The serotonin is going to spit out of that top part, and it's going to be received by the next nerve, right? So that area, that little gap, is between the two neurons. It's called the synapse. So the neurons aren't actually touching each other when they're firing from one to the other. There's a little gap of space that kind of is called the synaptic gap, right? That's the area where the transmission is taking place, right? So in the case of depression, the theory is that serotonin is not spitting, it's not firing correctly from one neuron to the other. And I know this might sound a little bit like too much information, a little gross, but like if you've ever had that feeling where you almost throw up in your mouth, but you haven't quite thrown up, it kind of regurgitates back, right? So you feel it kind of come up, and then it doesn't quite come up. It kind of shoots back down into your gastrointestinal tract. It kind of just goes back down. That is called a reuptake, right? So what's happening, the theory is that serotonin is supposed to be firing, but instead there's a couple of times when the serotonin is being sucked back up into the neuron instead of doing what it's supposed to do. It's reuptaking, right? So the idea of that medication, an SSRI, is to help the neuron do what its intended purpose was, which was to spit it out, right? So what happens is the SSRI blocks the serotonin from being reabsorbed. And instead of being reabsorbed, it spits to the next neuron. And when you have the right amount of serotonin, you'll have a good mood, you'll have a decent hunger, your sleep will be good, you'll be like have an arousal, as opposed to being really just like down, depressed, you can't move, you don't feel like getting up off the bed, right? So this is a drug that we sometimes use to help people get their neurotransmitters or serotonin working how we want them to work. So over on the left, those are the 6 neurotransmitters that you should be familiar with. There on this next slide, you will see a lot of vocabulary words that I want you to kind of take note of. You will be reading about those in the chapter, but make sure you understand what each of these words mean, just in case they show up later on an exam, okay? And that is that. We're going to talk briefly about reflexes. So what is a reflex action? So think of a reflex like your knee jerks or you sneeze, right? Blinking is a reflex. When we're talking about movement, that's a reflex. That's the simplest form of behavior, right? It involves an impulse conduction that happens over maybe 2 to 3 neurons, okay? That path that those neurons take, that path is called a reflex arc. Okay, so the simplest form of behavior is called a reflex, like a blink, right? A knee jerk. That path of the neurons, the 2 or 3 neurons, is called a reflex arc. We have sensory, which are also called afferent neurons. They transmit impulses from your sensory receptors. The senses are received, and those afferent neurons transmit that information to the spinal cord or the brain. Now, interneurons are located entirely within your brain and spinal cord. They intervene between the sensory and motor neurons. So again, senses, think about your senses, right? Your sight, your smell, right? Those are senses. And your motor neurons, that's movement. We're talking about movement. So motor efferent neurons transmit impulses from your sensory or interneurons to the muscle cells that contract or gland cells that secrete, right? So if we're talking about a knee jerk, right, that is happening with our efferent neurons, right? Because that is talking about muscle cells that are contracting, right? Muscle and gland cells are called effectors. Examples of your reflexes include your pupils, right? Your pupils, when they that reflex they do, that dilation that they do, that pupil reflex that we see in the fight or flight, reaction that we talked about earlier. Knee jerk, sneezing, blinking, these are all reflexes. Neural impulses travel one way along the neuron from the dendrites to the axons to the terminal buttons, and among neurons from the receptor to the effector. Okay, now that's the end of part 3, and just make sure you can go back and pause to write down some of these words that you need to kind of take note of in a notebook or in some sort of other way, so that you have it for studying for any exams we may have coming up soon. All right, thank you.